Okay, next general topic and shout out video. Okay, three things I'm hoping to discuss in this video. First, quick announcement. Second, general deck building strategies. And three, the shout out, which I'm hoping to. I'm hoping that this format will be working for me. But yeah, so the first quick announcement, as you may be able to see from the screen here, I am going to be introducing budget content. I guess you can't necessarily see the which decks are budget, but the reason why there's two of basically each of my decks is because for each of these decks there's basically a version that is that's slightly more budget. The one exception might be Merfolk, because the two exceptions are Merfolk and Mono Green, because Merfolk, I just think there's a limit to how budget you can make it, and I happen to be cutting Force Negation in the most recent version anyway. It might come back, but definitely in the most recent version I've been cutting it. So that already kind of budgetized it quite a bit. And I just have the Luris version because that's another version that I worked on in the past and I may want to work on in the future. Yeah, and Mono Green Effect is another exception because it's kind of already a budget deck, and I'm not really sure how else I would build it. So. But if another version pops up, I'll have like an alternative version to that deck as well. But yeah, I hope all of you like this idea. And I'm not sure how exactly I'm going to be fitting these into the rotation, but I am hoping to splice some. Have some budget content intermixed with the regular content. And honestly, for some of these decks, like for example the mono black deck, it's entirely possible that the version with Luris is better anyway. Sometimes the budget decks are actually better. In any case, just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, this is the non-budget version of the black deck. As you can see, the non-budget cards are Liliana for the most part, and and Chalice in the sideboard. But other than that, it's not too it's not too unbudget friendly. But yeah, Liliana is definitely a pricey card. But this is the quote budget version. Although honestly, this deck wasn't designed to be a budget deck. It just so happens that it is pretty budget. And honestly, this version might be better anyway. Because by the way, Dauthi Voidwalkers have fallen a lot in price, so don't worry, they're not too expensive. I do want to give a quick shout out to Rob Terry here on YouTube for suggesting Infernal Grasp. Look for this in the most recent content for the mono black deck, which if you're a patron should be coming up soon. But yeah, I recorded it I think relatively recently. But yeah, in any case, yeah. So this is the quote budget version of mono black. Now, Merfolk, like I said, is a little bit of an exception because I'm playing Luris Folk as my alternative version, and then and then just mono blue Merfolk without Luris as the other version. I just so happen to be moving away from Force Negation, like I said, anyway, in my most recent versions. And I'm not really so sure how much more we can budgetize this while still being competitive. I don't recommend leaving without Chalice, at least not in the versions I play. Certainly not in the mono blue version with all these bounce spells. And as much as I tried to cut Aether Vial, I'm just not sure you can really get away with doing that. I did actually try, but yeah. But when I tried, I just replaced it with Chalice in the main deck anyway. And Chalice is probably the easier cut from the sideboard. Like cutting a sideboard card is always easier than cutting a main deck card for budget purposes. But in any case, yeah. So this is the Merfolk decks I have for the time being. Yeah, mostly just two different versions because they're both fairly budget friendly anyway, as long as you don't have Force Negation, which, like I said, conveniently enough, I don't necessarily happen to be on anyway. Yeah, the Infect deck is already kind of budget. Like, I don't think there's any money card. Oh yeah, actually, these. Yeah, you know what? There might be a way to budgetize this. I'm not quite ready to really dive deep on that yet because Infect takes a lot of work to really find the right groove, and yeah, we'll see. Honestly, this is fairly budget friendly, but I forgot actually these hierarchs are not the cheapest stuff. I just don't know. This deck is very how can I say, very meta dependent and not necessarily the most intrinsically kind of powerful deck in the first. So I'm not really sure budgetizing it would be wise. But that being said, I have been noticing sometimes the budget versions might even be better with the mono black version and a new mono white budget version that I'm going to get to shortly. Jegantha Prowess back in the mix. I ran this recently, and I think you all would be probably pleasantly pleased to hear that actually this did fairly well. I don't want to necessarily spoil it, but yeah, if you follow me on Twitter, then you already know. But it's actually still got legs, and at least certainly in the gameplay footage, I hope you all agree that yeah, that this deck still has some advantages over mono red Obosh. Mono red Obosh like now is like a solidly a turn like 5 kill. Like it's very rarely ever going to even kill on turn 4. So if you miss killing on turn 4 and even sometimes on turn 3, I think this is the way to go. And Lava Dart really speeds things up. And but Lava Dart is even if we added Lava Dart to the Obosh red deck without prowess creatures, it's just not really going to do as much. But this version just goes full prowess, Abbott. Yeah, so I'm hoping that budget players will see. I think pound for pound in a way, like you probably get more bang for your buck with like the Jegantha Prowess version, at least starting out, than like with the Obosh version. You have to sink in so much extra money, but like I don't know that the rate of returns necessarily will like, how can I say, the rate of returns are not necessarily commensurate with how much money you have to step in, which is not to say that you shouldn't do it. I mean, obviously I'd like to win as much as possible, and I'm willing to shell out for the Ragavans and whatnot, but I'd be lying to you if I said that it seemed to me like the Ragavans are going to increase your win percentage, kind of like in a 1-for-1 ratio with how much money you spend for them. This version, I think, will continue. This version still has the potential to win and to win a lot. It just won't necessarily eke out, I think, a little bit more of those percentages that the insane power that Ragavan offers. But make no mistake, this deck offers a lot too, including, of course, Ratchet Bomb without disabling a companion on the sideboard, which is nice. But anyway, then of course Obosh mid-range, still testing out Trinosphere. Yeah. Mono White Blink Blade. Not really sure there's much new here. Obviously, Draeneth Magistrate. Yeah. Thanks, Mordescar. I think that's correct. Mordekaiser for suggesting the Squad Box. I mean, those have been on my mind. I've been testing them a lot, although in the other version. And yeah, one of the problems with a Squadron Hawk actually that I didn't necessarily realize at first, when you draw multiple of them in your hand, it's actually kind of bad. But anyway, it is a sweet card, and it's especially sweet with Solitude. I didn't necessarily get to test it in this deck a lot because I haven't been playing a lot of this deck lately, but I did test it in the other version I'm going to get to in a second, and it is a sweet card, but it is kind of frustrating that its stock goes down quite a bit when you have multiple copies in your hand. Plus it kind of thins your deck of threats a little later in the game. I couldn't help but feel that when I played Squadron Hawk, I drew just a bit more lands late in the game, and don't think that like thinning your deck of anything makes that big of a difference overall, but certainly in the beginning of the game. But if the game really drags on, you may start to notice it, and I just couldn't help but feel that I was just a little bit lighter on threats, a little bit lighter on like action spells, and I was a little heavier on land when I was playing Squadron Hawk, because I mean we were pulling 3 like non-land cards out of the deck. But that's probably. I think the bigger issue is just that you don't always get like a 1-for-3. You don't always get a 1-for-3, and it is ultimately a 2 mana for a 1/1 flyer. It's a solid card, but anyway, definitely shout out to Marceline on YouTube here for suggesting Draeneth Magistrate. This, for the most part, this only really hoses Cascade, but it hoses Cascade pretty well for the most part, because most Cascade players are bringing in Foundation Breaker and Force of Vigor, both of which don't do anything to Magistrate. So it's a pretty good card, I think, overall for Cascade. Yeah. And that of course brings us to Luris. Yeah, and this is actually the budget version, if you will, although it's really a totally different deck from the Blinkblade deck. But I actually plan to be using this deck as an example for a while for my general deck building tips discussion. But suffice it to say that I'm hoping you all will like me trying to jam this and see if this works. Believe it or not, this actually has been doing fairly good for me. It might even be doing better than the way more expensive Blink Blade deck. Which I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do, because I love these cards in the Blink Blade deck. I love playing them, but it is possible that just this more proactive kind of well, proactive and reactive. It's funny. It is more of this funky, but kind of more basic is not the right word. Less dirtily. Let's just call spade a spade. This less dirtily version of mono white just might be the way to go. But in any case, yeah, even though it's so much cheaper, but yeah, let me know if you like this idea of playing some budget content. But my understanding is that viewers have been some viewers have been losing interest since the decks progressively have gotten more and more expensive. I mean, Modern Horizons 2 injected so much like crazy expensive new cards, like Solitude, for example, in the white deck. But not most of which Ragavan is. Definitely Ragavan is the big culprit there in the Obosh red deck. But yeah, I'm hoping you all like this, and the upshot is testing a lot with this new deck, I think, has really given me good insight to discuss the next topic, which yeah, the next topic we'll discuss is general deck building tips. Since last week we did general sideboarding. I hope to make a more in-depth video sometime, but definitely starting off with the basics seems like a good idea. So yeah, let's use this deck as a baseline, because I've had a lot of experience, kind of in many ways, building a new deck from more or less scratch. I mean, I really did build it from scratch, because I identified pretty early on that this deck could not and would not be like very similar to the Blink Blade deck, mainly because Solitude, obviously, Solitude can't make the cut as a budget card. But and you know what? Actually, I guess we'll do two for the price of one, because also some budget. So like a budget tip that I have actually is, don't look for a card. I mean, don't when you're trying to make a budget deck. In my opinion, don't just take a deck like like a Mono White Blink Blade, and then just like take out Solitude because it's expensive, and replace it with something else, like say Winds of Abandon or something like that. Although, by the way, I'll get to that in a minute. Turns out Winds of Abandon is just absolutely insane. But yeah, my recommendation is don't necessarily think in terms of cutting, arguably core cards that are expensive. Try to like create a whole new deck. That's my suggestion, and that's kind of what I did here. Because the thing about like Solitude in the Blink Blade deck is I really think that card is just kind of central to the whole Blink strategy that it has going on. But that being said, yeah, the first tip that I have is basically focus. And focus obviously can apply to budget, like for like I just explained. Don't make just a worse version of an established archetype that's just cheaper. You want to find a core strength of a deck that, especially if you're building on a budget, may not necessarily have the most expensive cards, but whatever it is, you want to identify the main strengths of a deck, and you want to hammer those home. And so, yeah, the first, so the focus element here we can see in that we know we want this to be a Lurrus deck, and one of the reasons we wanted this to be a Lurrus deck is that Lurrus is going to give us a payoff for not playing some of the more expensive cards like Solitude, like the Stoneforge Mystic package. Since we're going to forego those, our plan was to forego those for budget reasons, it just made sense to just kind of to go for a really lean, low to the ground type of strategy, in order to take advantage of Lurrus and be rewarded for not playing those more typical Stoneblade type cards. And to that end, I think the deck actually does a pretty good job of playing more low to the ground, basic kind of threats that pack a decent I should say pack a decent punch, but basically do hopefully what they're supposed to do. Yeah. So now just as a big picture, the focus of this deck is basically Winds of Abandon. Um, yeah, like when I said basically you want to find the main strength of the deck and then basically hammer that home. And so what I discovered, and there was a lot of trial and error, but what I discovered after a lot of testing with this deck and prototype versions thereof is that Winds of Abandon is actually the key to making some type of deck like this work. Why? Because Winds of Abandon is both a very flexible card. It is both a very good early game, you know, a creature removal spell to get things out of the way, to just defend yourself, etc. But the main reason actually that Winds of Abandon is great is because of this overload. This overload ability to make it a one-sided wrath. Think of Winds of Abandon in this deck more as a 6-mana card that can sometimes be played for 2, rather than a 2-mana card that can sometimes be played for 6, because a lot of times we are actively building up towards playing this with overload. Because, see, the idea here is that there's basically 2 different types of decks that we're going to face. We're going to face grindy decks that, for the most part, are going to be trying to trade resources with us, like Lightning Bolt or Fatal Push or whatnot, our creatures. And the other types of deck we're going to be facing are like decks with lots of creatures. You know, think like Hammer Time, think like Elves, think like Mono Green Devotion, think like oh, I don't know, Goblins. Like, you know what I mean. These like decks that play a lot of creatures. I mean, Merfolk for that, depending on which version you're playing. Not so much my version, but like traditional Merfolk. Like, just think. So against, because if you think about that, and by the way, well, I should say, basically, you're going to face 2 types of deck. You're going to face decks that have a lot of creatures and decks that don't have a lot of creatures. And decks that don't have a lot of creatures, you know, be it the combo, control, or mid-range, at the end of the day, when we can just deploy these kind of dinky, you know, creatures that just get in there, they do actually finish the opponent off, and most of them do generate card advantage, like a Thraben Inspector, just a little 1/2 that could. Leonin Squire looks really janky here, but it's effectively kind of like a 2-mana Thraben Inspector, because more often than not, it's going to be returning a Mishra's Bauble or a Soul Guide Lantern. So it kind of quote draws a card, end quote, when it comes into play. Which means even if they kill it, it still gain card advantage. And Sanctifier and Vec just straight up can't be killed by Lightning Bolt or Fatal Push, or, you know, most of the played removal spells that aren't white. And if it's white, if it's Path to Exile, we get a land drop anyway, which can help us, you know, make tokens from Castle Ardenvale earlier. Yeah, and you know, of course, if it's Prismatic Ending, at least they had to trade even on mana, you know, 2 mana to deal with one of our 2-mana cards. But yeah, the kind of core, and of course, you know, Cathar Commander is a little bit of an exception, because obviously this card is as ever vulnerable to Lightning Bolt or even Gut Shot or Lava Dart or, you know, Brennan 6 as have you. But the fact that it has Flash actually, in my opinion, makes up for a lot in the sense that when you can play it at the end of their turn, sometimes you can kind of catch them in a spot where they don't necessarily want to use their mana that turn. You can also destroy artifacts and enchantments, which comes up quite a bit, especially with Urza Saga in the format. This thing has blown up a lot of Urza Sagas for me. But yeah, the core strategy of this deck is basically play creatures that are overall, you know, either resilient or, you know, have like some flexibility in their casting costs and aren't too expensive anyway. But yeah, basically like creatures that have resiliency and have utility. The only creature that doesn't really have utility per se is a Thraben Inspector. Obviously, it has, if you count card draws utility, it has utility, but you know what I mean, like utility other than just card draw. I mean, Cathar Commander deals with artifacts and enchantments. Leonin Squire can help rebuy, you know, both of these cards. But with Soul Guide Lantern, you can get like extra uses out of your comes into play, you know, ability. Like, for example, if they have like a Croxa in their graveyard, you can like cycle Soul Guide Lantern, and then play a Leonin Square, get it back to your hand, and then play it, and then snipe it out. So like you can get a little extra value sometimes from that comes into play exile effect due to Leonin Squire. And Sanctifier and Vec, of course, you know, clearing the graveyard for red and black cards. There's definitely some utility there in a lot of matchups for sure. But yeah, the entire focus of this deck is, you know, resilient and creatures that have good utility. That against the decks that don't have a lot of creatures, A lot of times we can just keep using these to pressure the opponent's life total. They'll either have a hard time removing them, hopefully, in the case of Sanctifier, or in case of the other cards, timing in terms of Cathar, or, the more common one, card advantage, Serbian Inspector, Leonin Squire, like if they're killing them, we're still going up on cards. So, yeah, just kind of makes life difficult for the removal-based non-creature decks, and Castle Ardenvale, of course, can just keep turning out 1/1s, which can turn up the pressure, even with even when we don't have any creatures left on the battlefield, which is I've actually been surprisingly impressed with. But yeah, and against like combo and control, obviously like these creatures don't necessarily hit the hardest. They other than Cathar Commando, they don't necessarily have a higher power ratio to their mana cost, but they'll still get in there. They'll still get the job done, even though their utility may not be as valued in all matchups. But the key thing, and of course combo, just depending on the combo, our sideboard cards may or may not be able to bail us out. But definitely we have at least some clock, even if it's kind of like a turn 5 at the earliest kind of clock. But yeah, so the focus is basically like utility cards, creatures that have utility or are resilient, and but this is where Winds of Abandon really comes into play, because the other type of deck that you're going to place is creature heavy decks, and that's where like this kind of strategy normally would fall short, and this would normally, I think, render the deck basically unplayable, because like we don't really have much evasion here. This is where normally Stoneforge Mystic fetching up some kind of nasty equipment, Caldera or Sword of Fire and Ice, or if it was Legacy, Umezawa's GT, but of course it's not Legacy, or Batterskull or whatever have you, just be able to suit up the creatures or just go to town on its own. Normally cards like Stoneforge Mystic would be necessary to kind of break board stalls, but here we actually have the ultimate board stall breaker in Winds of Abandon against the creature-based decks, unless they're also packing a lot of counter magic, which probably Merfolk is ironically probably this deck's worst matchup is probably Merfolk. Well, actually probably Tron is its worst matchup, but Merfolk is probably up there in one of this deck's worst matchups, because at least if it's playing Force of Negation and and Counterspell, which most of them are probably playing at least one or the other, simply because but what you'll find, simply because like they can counter Winds of Abandon, but for the most part you're going to find that the decks that can counter Winds of Abandon are not going to be heavy creature based decks, so you can most of the time you won't be overloading this anyway. Like against Murktide Regent decks, for example, you're almost never overloading it. You're just playing it for 2 mana. So if they counter it like whoop-de-doo, it's countering it for 6 that can be kind of a backbreaking deal. And the only deck that I can think of really that plays a bunch of creatures where we really want to whip this thing out for the overload cost of 6, but also plays counter magic is Merfolk. But yeah, like against elves, against goblins, against I don't know, a mono green devotion-ish deck that plays like lots of dinky green cards to ramp the devotion. Just trying to think of other decks. I mean, to some extent, Hammer Time. Yeah, I mean, Hammer Time is kind of like that. A lot of board states will end up with tons of creatures on the battlefield from them. Affinity, Domain Zoo. I mean, Domain Zoo is kind of scary because not only does it have a lot of creatures on the battlefield sometimes, but they're huge. But yeah, Winds of Abandon. Basically what this does is this is just our board stall breaking card, but it's also just useful for sniping off big threats that like the mid-range and sometimes control decks, depending on which one, but like mostly like the mid-range decks, the kind of big threats like the Tarmogoyfs and the Murktide Regents and the you name it. It's nice that it can snipe those out 1 for 1 for a pretty decent rate against those decks, but also just be a total house against the creature swarm kind of decks. So then, basically against this creature swarm decks, the idea here would become just kind of hold the fort with these, with these dinky, fairly, on average at least, more than 1 toughness, except for Cathar Commando, which can be a surprise blocker for like a 3-power creature or something if need be. But you kind of use these cards to hold the fort, and then you try to, draw cards until you draw Winds of Abandon, overload it, and then kind of crash in with your dinky army, basically. It seems janky. It seems like it wouldn't work, but I hope you like the videos that I'm going to have coming up with this deck hopefully soon, because I think there's definitely more than meets the eye. But all of that is to say that that is the focus of this deck. It took kind of a while to find it, but once I identified the play pattern that was bringing success with this deck, I kind of built around it, because like when you know Winds of Abandon, like that's in a lot of matchups, like that's kind of what we're building towards. So you know, like Leonin Squire, for example, it's a decent blocker against like at least smaller creatures. It draws a card, so it helps, you know, it helps us hit our land drops, and helps us draw into Winds of Abandon. Same thing with Draven Inspector. You know, half decent blocker, but more importantly, I mean, half decent attacker, half decent blocker. Also draws a card, you know, for land drops and drawing into winds. You know, I mean, I think I've already sung the virtues of these creatures enough, but they all just kind of both help. You know, they just help kind of set up the Winds of Abandon. When you ultimately get it, or they just get in there for damage against the other decks, while not necessarily putting you far behind when they trade for resources. So yeah, so that's the first principle, is focus, just like sideboarding. So the second, I guess the second principle is consistency, kind of like sideboarding, and that is that we want to be able to. Oh yeah, and I guess I forgot about Settle the Wreckage, but yeah, just real quick, Settle the Wreckage. Just this also kind of just feeds into our plan if we don't want to get overrun by creatures decks that have like bigger creatures. It also has a hidden kind of synergy with Winds of Abandon that might not be immediately apparent, in that it creates this situation where opponents won't necessarily want to be attacking with everything, so they might stall out, purposely stall their attacks, but then they kind of play into Winds of Abandon more, where this card can just completely wipe out the entire board that they've been, you know, not really pressing the pedal to the metal on. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's one little last comment about focus. But yeah, back to like the next principle, you know, consistency, which I guess consistency was the first principle that we had for sideboarding, but it's a very important principle for deck building too, and needless to say, that's kind of one of the important reasons to play 4-ofs generally. Yeah, playing lots of cards that draw cards, and you know, playing 4-ofs of everything, that together really helps make the deck gel. where basically we're hitting our land drops every turn. We're seeing the key cards more frequently. I think it's really important that when you build the deck, you try to achieve some type of consistency, and you either do that through redundancy, like a burn, or you can do that through lots of card draw and playing, you know, a lot. I mean, I guess redundancy also is why you play 4-ofs. But in a way, it's also kind of like playing Draven Inspector and, you know, Squire. Not exactly the same card, but they do similar things for the deck. And playing lots of removal, like, you know, Path, Settle the Wreckage, Winds of Abandon. So there's not much more to say about the consistency issue, but yeah. So what's the next principle, you know, to deck construction that I look for? I think the next principle, this is maybe a little bit of an MHayashiism, but if possible, and not every deck will necessarily be able to achieve this, like for example, my Merfolk deck isn't necessarily, but if I can, a lot of times I'm going to be looking to cover bases even in the main deck, if possible. So when I was going through the card database here on MTGO, looking for decent creatures, this is how I stumbled across Cathar Commando. I was just looking at creatures from the most recent set, and this caught my eye. I mean, I'm sure this card didn't necessarily set the world on ablaze, and lots of people are talking about it. But from me, I feel like this is the type of card that actually would have got more attention if it was like a rare, for example. I feel like people just see rare and they're like, you know, oh, look at this, look at all this does. You You know, I can definitely see, like, maybe not today, but I can definitely see, it's funny, I could definitely see this like 5 to 10 years ago being a rare. Um, but yeah, I really like what this card brings to the table because, like I said, you know, with the third principle being basically try to cover as many bases as you can without necessarily diluting the focus of the deck. That's the key thing. That's how I can describe it. You want to try to cover. You want to try to cover as many bases as you can without diluting the focus, and that's why I love Cathar Commando, because this really fits in to the focus of the deck. It's a good beater for when we're facing like the decks that don't have a lot of creatures. It's also a pretty decent blocker, mainly due to flash, because they don't necessarily know that they might be trading like a three mana 3/3. I don't know. They don't necessarily know that they're trading like something into like a 2 mana flash blocker that can block and trade with anything up to 3 toughness. So it can be a pretty good blocker. It can be a pretty good attacker. And it can destroy an artifact or enchantment. So I think overall this card really complements the deck strategy pretty well, while not diluting the focus really much at all. I actually thought about moving this to the sideboard, but pretty quickly kind of just brought it back around, just because I just feel like I don't like losing decks, you know, losing games to like Sword of Fire and Ice, Batter Skull, yeah, or like Urza Saga. Like there's a lot of cards that can pose a lot of problems for us, and this card actually just really helps just really helps us in that regard. I don't know what else to say. And the key point is it does all this. It does all these good things, but all of those things, you know, feed into the strategy. Like, for example, if we weren't necessarily if we didn't necessarily have this sum theme of wanting to stall in some games for the Winds of Abandon, this being a good flash blocker may not necessarily have as high ratings. You know, but the fact that it definitely feeds into that. Oh, and another thing, it also has synergy with Settle the Wreckage, because since it has flash, and if your opponent sees it, for example, they don't necessarily know if you're leaving mana up just to flash this in, or if you have Settle the Wreckage. You know, you could just be going to play this at the end of their turn, because I mean, why not? You know, if you played it flash / instant speed. But yeah, so another good example of a card that you probably will see in a lot of my decks. In a lot of my decks, you'll see like a Relic of Progenitus, but here, of course, it's Soul Guide Lantern, because it just has way better internal synergy with the deck, with Leonin Squire and Luris. You know, again, focus. But yeah, so this really exemplifies, I think, the principle of trying to cover bases as long as they don't cause your deck to lose focus. I mean, you know, this card is great because it allows us to interact with the graveyard in game 1, while also you know, feeding into the focus, not just not going against the focus of the deck, but actually feeding into it, because you know, it's a part of the card advantage and card advantage engine with Leon and Squire. Like, you know, it gives you something to return to your hand if you don't happen to have Bauble, which comes up more than you might think. Also, it gives you something to recur with Luris if you don't have anything else, which also comes up more than you think. So yeah, it's a very good way to cover. I mean, like, you know, I won a decent amount of games against Timor Living In, for example, that I probably wouldn't have won. I definitely wouldn't have won in game 1 without this, and who knows if I would have won games 2 and 3 if I didn't have this awesome Graveyard Hate. Oh, and Reanimator, don't forget that. But yeah, who knows if I would be able to have such a good matchup against some of these decks if I didn't have this powerful main deck interaction. That, again, not only in this deck doesn't conflict with the focus, but actually actively synergizes with the focus of the deck. So yeah, and by the way, my phone just came off, so for those who noticed that my phone kind of might be causing some interference, I'm curious if it did there. I kind of put it further away this time. But in any case, so what's another example of, you know, covering bases? I mean, obviously there's the creature removal, but yeah. Yeah, so that's oh yeah, I guess Sanctifier and Vac is another good example there too of covering bases, because like against some decks, for example, they might want to it's kind of similar to Soul Guide Lantern, but basically Sanctifier enables us to interact with with a lot of red and black graveyard hate type cards. Um, and just it's just a terrific blocker against Ragavan. Also, it can block Omnath and Fury, and can just do a lot of good stuff for us. But it feeds into the core strategy of the deck fairly well. It's a pretty efficient beater, and the fact that it has protection from the two best creature removal colors, again, kind of like I explained earlier on with just the discussion of focus, it just helps us cover more bases. I mean, like we could play it in the sideboard, but just playing it in the main deck also frees up sideboard space, but just covers black and red, as bases pretty, particularly including graveyard strategies from black and red, pretty well, without conflicting with the focus. So yeah, that's the third principle, is try to cover bases. Meaning like cover the and of course, Field of Ruin. Don't forget that. I mean, this is just kind of like a gimme card in a format that has Earth Saga in it. But Field of Ruin is a pretty good card here instead of like Ghost Quarter, for example, just because we do want a lot of mana for our Castle Ardent Vales. And there is some consideration maybe between like Castle Ardent Vale and Cave of the Frost Dragon. I like Cave of the Frost Dragon better in the Blinkblade deck because I'm not necessarily holding mana all the time. Like, kind of help that have like turning out tokens, and sometimes they can just get there. Games actually have one where creating tokens, and then the tokens kind of either help get there or just kind of get there on their own. It's actually more than you might think. Yeah, so I guess that is kind of the main point as to and this is maybe the last major deck building tip that I have for for how I approach my deck building. Resilience to Mana Screw and Mana Flood, which I know that sounds kind of like a no-brainer, but hear me out. There are ways you can go about this to do a better job of that. In this deck in particular, a lot of that comes down to Secluded Step, basically. I mean, it's a Secluded Step and just in general playing a lot of utility lands. Obviously, this deck plays 12 basic planes, so it doesn't necessarily play as many utility lands as some of my other lists. But one of the reasons why you see these cycling lands a lot in a lot of my deck lists is that they're just very solid, because when you have a lot of lands, which comes up more than you think, you will a lot of times just lose for not having anything to do. And Secluded Step sometimes lets you just draw into like that critical path or that critical, Sanctifier Invec or whatever it or Settle the Wreckage or whatever have you. Like instead of just drawing nothing but land. But when you don't really have a lot of your lands, like you can keep some hands that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. Like for example, if you have 1 plains and 2 Secluded Steps, I mean that's an easily keepable hand. So it's just a really sweet card because, yeah, like it's a land when you need it. It's a spell when you don't need more lands. In this particular deck, Horizon Lands are another common good card to consider for mitigating both Mana Screw and Mana Flood, but they're both not necessarily as budget friendly, which is kind of nicer for this deck. They also conflict with Castle Ardent Vale, which I know Secluded Step does too, but I think of Secluded Step more like a 1-mana draw spell that can be played as a tap land rather than a tap land that can also be a draw spell. So I think of it like this deck has 12 planes for Castle Ardent Vale, which I think is fine, and then has these draw spells that can also be like 2 and only had 10 planes, then Castle Ardent Vale may not come into play untapped as much. Plus, there's almost always something to do with extra mana thanks to Castle Ardent Vale, so I'm not necessarily as in need of being able to cycle those Horizon lands all the time. But also, this deck does not necessarily have any life gain in the main deck. and it can have kind of a rough time against burn. So definitely, I don't want to take any extra damage that I don't have to. So that's another reason not to play Horizon Lands. So yeah, yeah, Secluded Steppe is obviously the poster child for mitigating mana screw and mana flood. As for the rest of the cards, there's not that much that I feel like I can honestly do to mitigate mana screw. You just kind of, I think I generally prefer to play 24 lands, unless like the deck just kind of can't. Like I think Jegantha Prowess, at least presently, kind of has to play 20 lands to make sure that it has enough, spell density so that the prowess creatures don't just sit around unable to attack. But in this version, in this deck, yeah, playing 24 lands goes a long way in mitigating mana screw. The Secluded Steppes help mitigate mana flood. Probably they're the best example of that. But Castle Ardenvale, like I've been alluding to, I mean that's the other kind of piece of the equation. Like even when we've got lots of mana, we're almost always gonna be able to sink it into creating some extra tokens, which are better than they might seem. I mean these things can chump block big creatures later in the game. They can just get in there against decks that try to trade 1-for-1 with the creatures. These little 1/1s, even with no other way to pump them or anything, do more for you than you might think. And yeah, and I think and then I think the fifth and final, if I'm keeping my my count correct, but I think the final general deck building strategy, the basic general deck building strategy that that I think is valuable here. And maybe I'm missing something. Let me know if there's something kind of obvious that for some reason is not coming to mind. But yeah, it's basically being aware of the other decks in the metagame and being aware of what kind of decks your deck might be weak to, and then trying to like shore them up if possible. In other words, kind of metagaming with the deck. And once again, I think this deck does kind of provide a pretty decent example of that. Like I just went over, one of the reasons this deck is not playing Horizon Lands is because this deck has a little bit of a rough burn matchup. But for example, when I say metagame deck, I think it's also important to recognize that there are some matchups that your deck is just not kind of going to beat, and I don't think it makes much sense to really devote that much more, time, that much more effort to really shoring them up if you kind of correctly identify them as basically lost causes. And in this deck, that's kind of Tron. Like I don't feel like just sticking Leonin Arbiter in the sideboard is going to shore up the Tron matchup, which is kind of why I'm not. I just really don't. I feel like Leonin Arbiter plus Field of Ruin plus Ghost Quarter plus Thalia plus I don't know. Plus other stuff. I don't know. Even Mind Sensor. Like I don't know. Like if we had more plus Tectonic Edge. I mean, like, no, I mean you don't need that much hate, but I just feel like that could in a way be its own category. But yeah, just one of the things you want to do is you want to identify some matchups that that are basically a lost cause, and then we want to identify the bad matchups first, and then identify whether they're lost causes or if a little shoring up might make you recover enough percentage points where you could reasonably expect to beat them. And Burn is a good example of that because, like I was saying, that's one of the reasons why I prefer not to play Horizon Lands in this deck. It's just the percentage points I lose to decks like Burn, or to some extent, other decks like Domain Zoo can sometimes burn you out. Murktide can, although they're usually only playing Lightning Bolt to do that, but connecting a few times with Ragavan or DRC can easily put you in Lightning Bolt range. But yeah, so like foregoing the Horizon Lands is a good nod to being aware that this deck has no main deck life gain. It has a relatively slow clock, not as slow as the Blinkblade deck, but a relatively slow clock. So we may want to, and most of the especially quick clock creatures like Cathar are pretty vulnerable to burn spells. So being cognizant of that, I think, is an important is something to be aware of. But yeah, in a way, this kind of goes together with covering bases. But and in a way, kind of it could like go a little more to sideboarding. But I think that but a good main deck example of this, excuse me, is actually Settle the Wreckage, because once again, I feel like Settle the Wreckage is kind of a concession to the fact that since this deck doesn't play a lot of really big creatures, since a lot of the creatures are a little more kind of value oriented, either through card advantage or just through having like a useful ability or useful utility, we do leave ourselves a little vulnerable to rush down by creatures that are just focused on being super beefy. And a good example of that is Domain Zoo. I mean, don't think for 1 second that just having 8 removal spells like Path and Winds of Abandon actually makes you favored against those decks. Because, I mean, they play Tarmogoyf, they play, I don't know if all of them play Tarmogoyf, but they play like Scion of Draco, they play Territorial Kavu, they play Bloodbraid Elf, they play General whatever his name is, they play Shardless Agent, they play, I do think they play Tarmogoyf, they play Mantis Rider. Like, there are so many. Oh, sometimes they play Wild Nicodle. There's so many powerful creatures that they play out. Basically all of which outclass our creatures. So like one way we just kind of cover for that, is Settle the Wreckage. It just really kind of helps, and that and that in turn helps set up the Winds of Abandon later on, even if they don't necessarily attack into it. So I feel like Settle the Wreckage is a pretty good example of, in a way, you could say metagaming. Being cognizant of what other decks are out there, what other types of decks are out there, and trying to make certain concessions and maybe choose certain cards based on that. It is entirely possible that Settle the Wreckage may not necessarily stand in the deck for, but I've been liking it precisely for that reason. In this deck in particular, a card like Fateful Absence could go in the main deck, but in some attrition-based matchups, it's just so it's just so bad to give them like a clue token. But it is very useful in against decks that like there's certain specific creatures that just have to be killed, or we just need more instant speed removal of any type. Like for example, Hammer Time or Planeswalkers. Sometimes you just have to be able to deal with them. But yeah, I think. Maybe real quick, Jegantha Prowess. This I think is another example of like, these principles that that I'm explaining, like, focus. Like, I'm trying to play into its strengths, Lava Dart, light up the stage. I'm not trying to just be like a worse version of Obosh. I'm like, the deck is focused on getting a lot of prowess triggers, pushing through damage. Consistency. I mean, this deck plays cards like Abbot of Keep, crack to draw a card, and we will more than you might think. There's a lot of ways that we can just cycle through our deck. Really helps us actually see a lot of the cards that we need. I mean, it doesn't have as much card draw as the white deck, but I think consistency is definitely still quite a critical part. Of the deck. And then of course there's covering bases. Blood Moon is kind of the best example. Like honestly, that's kind of like the principle of why I started playing Blood Moon in the prowess decks in the first place. I was boarding it in basically every single time, and I just realized like what it was doing for me was it was basically covering a lot of bad matchups. Like there were some matchups where I didn't necessarily need Blood Moon, but a lot of times I would win anyway, even if Blood Moon was almost a dead card. And it's never completely a dead card because it's still prowess triggers if you think about it. Plus you can pitch it with Valakut Awakening, But just there's so many combo control, like certain types of decks where like if you can't mess with their mana in a significant way, they can just overcome you But Blood Moon is just it's an excellent way to cover a lot of our bases that actually kind of synergizes with the main deck here because of this prowess triggers. Excuse me. And also because Den of the Bugbear aside, the you know, it doesn't necessarily conflict with like our most powerful kind of, you know, draw land, utility land. So yeah, and that basically holds true for the Obosh deck as well. So, you know, also lots of card draw. So lots of consistency, lots of focus. Although in this case, the focus is maximum grind. You know, Fury, Seasoned Pyromancer, Bone Crusher, Hammer Garden. You know, like just maxing out the grind. Blast Zone. So a little bit of a different focus because the focus is more on grinding than speed. But yeah, the focus is definitely there. You know, covering bases. I mean, you know, freaking main deck Relic, Pirate Spellbomb, and main deck Relic. You know, other than the Hammer, which is not usually going to be going into the graveyard before turn 3 anyway, so that's plenty of time where usually you can cycle Relic if you correctly identify that they're not a graveyard base deck. Yeah, you know, we basically have our bases covered. In the just all in the main deck here in the Obosh red deck specifically, not as much in the Jegantha version, because the Jegantha version's focus of speed means that we can't quite justify playing like Blast Zone. We can't quite justify playing like Relic, which doesn't do damage, and also kind of conflicts with Lava Dart because a Lava Dart flashback very well might be in our graveyard before, like, I mean, you know, it might be sitting in our graveyard way earlier than we would like. Sorry. But yeah, anyway. But yeah, in Obosh Red, like, we basically have our bases covered, you know, artifacts and enchantments, plus other stuff. Even Pro Red, and Blast Zone too. You know, graveyard-based strategies, non-basic lands, you know, creatures for the most part. Like, we basically have our bases covered, and it doesn't, like, especially in the Obosh version, this doesn't conflict with the strategy at all. I mean, this helps draw cards. It can help grind because it can help undo cards of the opponents that can grind even better than ours, like Kroxa. So it's, you know, it really doesn't mess with the focus much at all, and it really does help cover bases. You know, Blast Zone also just goes to the grind, and, you know, and Blood Moon. So yeah, and of course you know, mitigating Mana Flood and Mana Screw. Obosh Red is another example of that. Like, again, we're playing 24 lands. Don't let the land counter at 20 fool you, because it's not counting the Valakut Awakenings. So we're playing 24 lands, but we're also playing 4, you know, basically super cycle lands. So yeah, and we have something to do with the mana because of Blast Zone, but, you know, a lot of times we have something to mitigate Flood in the form of Hammer Garden, which basically always gives us something to do with our mana, which is actually one of the main reasons why we're even playing it. And, you know, again, like I explained before, you can pitch it with Seasoned Pyromancer, and then you can just get a lot of value out of your mana without even necessarily needing to you know, pay the initial cost of 3 mana. You can just, at your leisure later in the game when you feel like it, just pay 5 and bring it back when the game's going really long. So yeah, Jegantha Prowess is a little bit of exception to the try to mitigate as much as possible Mana Screw, Mana Flood, although it's doing more of that than you might think. So I think this helps us get away with playing 24. Well, actually, Abbott really helps hit our land drops, because if you think about it, as long as you have at least 2 lands, and as long as you can make it to turn 3, then basically if you play an Abbott on turn 3 before playing your land drop, you will always either reveal a land off the top or a non-land card. If it's a land, great, play it. If it's a non-land card, well, you're that much closer to land next turn. So the bottom line is Abbott always has this unique attribute to it, that it will help you find your lands. It will help you find more of your lands later in the game. It just does by its very nature. So yeah, I think all of that does lead to us being able to get away with not necessarily playing 24 lands, but still having a fairly good mitigating Mana Screw and Mana Flood decently well. This deck does not necessarily mitigate Mana Flood as well as Obosh, though, because it doesn't have Hammer Garden to constantly recur. But the Den of the Bugbears are a little bit of a concession here, a relatively free one. You know, if we don't have a Blood Moon out, we can maybe get some attacks in later in the game when we don't have anything else to do with our mana. Valakut Awakenings. Unlike the Obosh deck, we don't have Seasoned Pyromancer, so we're free for the most part to actually just kind of collect extra lands in our hand. and then we can ditch all of them with Valakut Awakening if we draw it. Yeah. So, oh yeah, and by the way, with a 20 land deck, statistically, if you think about it, that's 1/3 of your deck as lands. 40 non-land cards, 20, 20 lands. That's basically a 2 out of 3 ratio for your non-lands and a 1 out of 3 ratio for your lands. And that means that any given 6 cards you draw, you can expect on average about 2 of them to be lands, because again, 2 out of 6 is 1/3, so 1/3 of your deck is land. So that means that, and since 7 cards is greater than 6, that on average your 7-card opening hand, you should be expecting to see at least 2 lands. And as long as you have 2 lands, generally Abbott can help you hit your extra land drops, light up the stage as well. And of course, if you have to mull, you're that much more likely to see better lands, having extra chances at it. So yeah, and then finally the final principle, trying to metagame for cards out there. I mean, like, we'll pick freaking playing main deck Sanctifier and Vec. I mean, what is a person to do, right? Pirate Spellbomb, right? So like Pirate Spellbomb definitely is a nod to trying to be aware of potential problematic cards opponents could be playing. I think I really started playing this in like the heyday of like Heliod, where this could help deal with like Uriok Champion. But again, since it always cycles, there's just a limit to like how bad this ever can really be. It's better than it might look. Not really sure what else to say, because like, yeah, I mean the same principle of Blood Moon that I described before. Blood Moon just really, Blood Moon, it's a nod to I think, did I discuss this in Focus? I mean, maybe I discussed this a little bit in Focus, but I mean, this is also, I think, a very critical card to keep in mind for basically metagaming. Just because the reality is, most of the decks that are not susceptible to the Rushdown plan, or as susceptible, are susceptible to Blood Moon. Like Elementals, or decks like that. Like, even if they do play a lot of cards that can really grind you out pretty well and can absorb the early punishment, like the evoke creatures and whatnot. It just so happens that the way the metagame shakes out, a lot of times Blood Moon is going to help shore up a lot of these problematic matchups. Again, like I said before, in the matchups where you don't necessarily need Blood Moon, a lot of times it's fine. A lot of times you win anyway. But in the matchups where you really need Blood Moon, you really need Blood Moon. So it is just kind of a metagame call. It has that unique ability too. Don't get caught up in certain, like in evaluating certain cards like Blood Moon for playing in the main deck. Don't get necessarily caught up on the few times that the card isn't necessarily, or even if it is fairly substantial, don't get caught up on the times where the card is not necessarily doing a lot of work. Try to get caught up more on how much that actually costs you the game. Because what I started to notice about Blood Moon is that the rate at which this card was not necessarily doing a lot of work was like that was not what I should be focusing on. What I was noticing is most of the games where this card was not doing a lot of work, I was still winning anyway. But in the games where this card was shutting the opponent down, it seemed like I really needed this in order to be able to win. So I think that's a very important evaluation to make with with potential cards, is how do they shore up specific problems? Do they are your good matchups good enough that you can afford to play like a possible close to dead card in the main deck? Do your bad matchups demand like a heavy-handed answer enough to play that in the main deck? And if the answer is against your good matchups, a lot of times you can afford like at least one dead card in the main deck, but your bad matchups really demand some kind of heavy-handed answer, then you may find yourself also playing. It doesn't just apply to Blood Moon. Like, think of any type of card, card out there that does the same thing. But the overarching feature is just it's just like I said, like with those cards out there are really honestly a lot of times kind of the key to pushing the deck up like a whole tier slot in a way. So yeah, that's those are the 5 principles basically. You know, and I hope you all found this informative. I mean, this is coming up about like an hour. I This wasn't as scripted as like the Why Do I Play Foros video, but I really didn't want to delay this further. So hope you all enjoyed. Definitely thank you to all of you. Brett, Alexis, you know, and shout out to Alexis, by the way. I believe that's Alexis Torres on Twitter and here on YouTube. Shout out, you know, just shout out for being a patron, but also shout out for suggesting Fatal Absence in that in the Luris White Weenie deck. I think this card is a pretty good role player. I don't know if it's going to necessarily always make the cut, but it's always a nice option to keep in mind. That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks, Alexis. Thanks, Pavilas Tomasauskas. Thanks, Frederick LeMay, Tyler Smith, Jonas Sandiger, Alexei Sherbeko, Brendan Hopgood, Jeff Clark, Adam Boyd, Gabriel W., Rodrigo Tomazzi, Andrew Watts, Yuha Landinoja, Brad Rispone, Sergey Perez Casas, Lucas Frank, Simon Grondin, Andre Simbayazi, Greasy Choirboy, Rick, Spencer, Courtesy, and Corey Skinnon. Thank you a lot. I hope all of you like this. I know this has been going on for a while, but yeah, and definitely hoping to do more of the user suggested content. So you know, feel free to chime in. This was actually a user suggested content, a user suggested idea from Lexus7. So shout out, definitely thanks Lexus7 for the suggested topic of broader deck building tips. Yeah, there might be more I can say, but I think I hit on all the basics. Anyway, it's been going on long enough. Thank you, everybody. Until next time, I really hope that that these videos have been helpful.